E aku nui e aku rahi tēnei te mihi mai haka koutou. Kei te mia hoki hokainga o tēnei rohe ara ko Ngāi Tahu nā mihi nui. Good morning, greetings, welcome to you all. My name is Kyla Colbin. I am the founder and chief executive of Boma. It is now my incredible honor to welcome Dr. Hana O'Regan to this Boma Impact session. Dr. O'Regan is an extraordinary Maori language advocate, the chief executive of Tātai Aotearoa Core Education, an educator, an activist, a leader, an inspiration. Hana, such an honor always to welcome you here. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm turning it over to you.
Kia ora Kyla, nei rā te mihi atu kia koe, hoi anō kia koutou katoa e toro atu ana te mihi nui. Mai o tautahi. So just to everybody, I've seen already in the chat, people from all around the country, it is a chilly morning here in Christchurch, but it's warmed by the fact that everyone has taken the time out of their day today to join in this conversation on equity. So kia ora everybody. And a big mihi to our takata turi whānau, our deaf community as well. Thank you again for participating. Nei rā te mihi atu, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Okay. I will do my best not to speak at extremely fast speed, but I do get a little bit excited on this. So just a warning that I will try. I've got the O'Regan thing going on where I really speak fast, but I'm going to try and make sure that I manage that and get through this conversation with you all today. So let's get started. And we'll do that by getting into the first slide. So I wanted to set the scene a little bit, set the scene around, and you can see the title, Navigating the Cultural Landscape. It's to set the scene by talking about how much of our dialogue over the last 20 or so years has been around a whole range of different topics. But like, as you can see, some of the words there, cultural revitalisation, bilingualism, te tiriti, identity politics, these things. And I've been speaking for about 29 years, not that you need to judge the age, but for a long time on these issues. And I have often got anxious before I go in to do a speech. I get concerned and I prepare myself really for an attack. So I want you to just think about this for a moment. Why would I be feeling like I would be getting attack or rebuttals if I mention something like biculturalism, that I'm going to talk about biculturalism or bilingualism? Please share in the chat if you've got an idea about what do you think I might hear back of people who might not have a view where they're open to talking about biculturalism or te tiriti, for example. What do you think some of the things are that I might hear? I agree. I agree that some of it will be around, yeah, okay, great. Thank you. Separatism, apartheid, it's racism. Why are we talking? We're all one country. Aren't we all the same? Fantastic. That's a good one I've just seen in the chat. I'm reading at speed now. You're doing a good job. One of the big things is about, like, we're a multicultural society. What about everyone else? So I think you get the idea why I would be anxious and preparing myself for this. Well, one of the reasons why after all this time, I've actually landed on talking about equity is because as a country, we haven't spent that long talking about equity. So we haven't got all the defences ready to hit. We haven't got people who have those rebuttals and those one-liners that they're able to throw already. And I've actually found that I can open the door to a conversation using equity, say a lot of the same things, but actually people are more open to listening to it. And let's be honest, you have to be a bit of an idiot to turn around and say, I don't agree with equity. I don't want equitable outcomes for all Aotearoa or for all people. You do sound like a bit of an egg. There are other words we could use, but this is public, so I'll just leave it with an idiot or an egg for the moment. So I just use that because I want us to set the conversation with an equity lens. So, but to understand that I will be talking from my own personal experience, and I'll talk about Māori and Māori experiences, but as a way of starting a broader conversation on equity. So many of the same things and experiences can be taken from Māori and applied generally. But I'm going to be starting in this short period of time talking with, as I say, largely with that Māori lens. So why focus on mana taurite? Why focus on equity? Well, the reality is that equity is it's a conversation that we haven't really spent a lot of time talking about as a country. I want to look at it really through a Te Tiriti lens as well. I do it because I believe that we have burdened the kaupapa of biculturalism with generations of these negative reactions, and that commentary really undermines the deep conversation around equity. As a country, we need to understand our history, our story, our narrative of inequity. And the reason why we haven't told that story very well is because, well, we've actually had another narrative that is dominated that says that we're all okay and that we're actually pretty good. Often we compare ourselves to Australia and we think we're amazing, but we haven't really engaged in the conversation. And if you're not somebody who experiences inequity on a regular basis, if you're not that person that is that might see it occurring with your family or yourself as an individual, you might not see what's right in front of you. And that's why it's hard. And that's also why it's important that we deliberately look and to apply an equity lens when we have this discussion. It is hard, mainly because we haven't had the conversation very well. And because, as I say, we haven't told our story well. We've also got a really strong blame culture. And when I say blame culture, it is about blaming others for why things are. It's always someone else's fault. I'll give you the example within education that sometimes you would hear people in primary school saying, the reason our children aren't succeeding in primary school is because they didn't get the support right from early childhood. Then secondary school say that the reason they're not succeeding is because of primary school. Tertiary blame secondary. Employers blame tertiary. And if all else fails, we blame the farmer. We've got a really strong blame culture going on. But we also feel personally attacked. And so personally feel attacked and as if we're made to feel guilty when someone highlights inequity. So we don't feel positive if somebody raises it. Immediately people go into blaming others for making people feel uncomfortable. And I think that's really important to know that we haven't really matured as a country in terms of the way we have the conversations and how willing we are to see what's in front of us. So let's talk about equality versus equity. The dominant narrative that we have as a country about ourselves is one of equal opportunity. Egalitarianism, that idea that everyone is equal and has an equal chance. Now, what that means and how people interpret that is that if people don't succeed, it's their own fault. It's their family's fault. They obviously didn't value education or wherever, or whatever, sorry. So equality, as you can see with this picture, is when everyone has exactly the same box to stand on, but of course, not everyone is able to reach, as you can see with that picture, reach up to the same way if they do not have extra supports. Now, what happens when we have this conversation about equality versus equity is that we get drawn into this notion of what's fair. And we base what's fair or unfair based on an individual position. So you might not need a box to reach the books, but if you don't get a box, that's unfair because you didn't get the box, even if you didn't need it. that's when we start feeling that idea of it's unfair, it's not okay. That also, we have this way of behaving that we feel like we're losing something. Something's been taken away from us if somebody else gets it. Even if you didn't need it, you feel like you're losing something. And so that's why concepts like, or practices like affirmative action to address inequity are often argued as being unfair. So just think about that in terms of I know most people who are joining a session on equity will understand that difference, but think about it in terms of the conversations we have in our communities around these two things and the way people react to it. So why do we think the way we do? It's hard for us to shift our views and beliefs about a history if we haven't had access to that history. We have to understand that the narrative, the story that we've heard as a country, that we've been exposed to intergenerationally, has been deliberate and designed to support the political and economic and social outcomes that we have. I want to make the disclaimer, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. When I say that it's been deliberate, I'll give you some examples and some evidence to show you. But it does sound a little bit conspiracy theorist. I understand that. But really think about the fact that what we have now and what's caused that to happen, and understanding that there have been deliberate actions that have been put in place, and policies and practices to make the outcome that we have now. I also want to say, just going back to that idea of people feeling attacked if we shine a light on things that aren't good, I want us to understand that we are a product of our time. We are a product of what we have been exposed to, how we have been educated, what we have heard, and that's what I mean, a product of our time. I'll share with you, just on that concept, a quote that my father said to me. Well, it wasn't a quote, he said it to me. And he said it to me when I was angry at him because I thought he wasn't, I was interviewing him on the radio, and I thought he wasn't strong enough at coming out and rebutting and attacking this group of racists who were absolutely putting down and throwing abuse at him, at our tribe. This is back in the early 1990s. And I thought Dad wasn't being strong enough. And when we got off the radio, I said to him, Dad, how come you're so weak? You need to throw it to them. Give it back to them, Dad. And he very calmly said to me, Hana, if you only knew what they only know, you'd probably think the same. I was mortified. How dare he even say that? But I was also quite taken aback because I didn't have a response. Afterwards, I thought I didn't like it because I wanted him to be angry at these blatant racist people, but it made sense. What he was saying, that I had an access to a history and conversations and information that others hadn't. And if I hadn't have been privileged to hear those things, then I might have thought the same. So I want us to think about that in terms of how important it is to make sure we're hearing the information that we might not usually hear, or applying an equity lens if we don't experience that inequity in a way that we can see things we might not ordinarily see. So let's unpack what we know about our story of us as New Zealanders. In a minute, I'm going to ask you to share your thoughts on the chat, and I will do my best to read and follow at speed. So I want you to think and share with me, please, in the chat, what are the commonly known characteristics or emblems of New Zealand Kiwi identity? When people think and talk about Kiwis, what do they think or say? What are we known for? Please share some of your views. Oh, number 8 wire, the kuru, clean and green, easy going, hard working, laid back, the haka, All Blacks, ingenuity, she'll be right, mate, Oh, that's good. Beach, barefoot, fish and chips. Sport, friendly, fair. All Māoris are funny. Thank you. You're welcome. Tall poppy syndrome, mountains to the sea, female prime minister, green, sheep, Lord of the Rings, get on with it. I think that means that we're, we just get on with it, do things. In New Zealand, yeah, good point, I think, about the different characteristics of now and what might have been said 10 years ago. Okay, so yep, number 8, wire, Kiwi ingenuity, awesome, indigenous education, friendly and warming. Okay, let's have a look now at something I prepared earlier. And thank you for everybody who quickly typed. I see there, punch above our weights one, and as you can see, it's a pretty accurate. You would have got a really good mark in NCEA if this was a test. Pretty much even down to the fact that we've got number 8 wire, which I learned recently isn't necessarily something all generations understand. But the idea of the gumboots, laid back, that the she'll be right attitude, even down to the words punch above our weight. What this shows us is that we tell a really good narrative. And I can tell you now, doesn't matter if I go to the far north or the far south, the same kind of examples come through. So it's not about whether or not you're in Christchurch or Kāi Tahu. There is a little bit of a difference in terms of how quickly people say sheep or gumboots or jandals, but generally we have this really dominant narrative about ourselves. And it's actually quite affirming, even though that this is a dominant narrative, it's affirming because we've done such a good job at telling that story that it is well known and it becomes part of that sense of a strong sense of our identity. Interestingly enough, the tall poppy is usually the only negative thing that comes through. And even that is not necessarily always seen in the negative. I want you to do the same exercise now. And I realize this is for those who have come to the session of equity, this might be a bit confronting, but I want you to do the same thing now, not about what we think, but what other people talk about in terms of the story of Māori. When I say other people, it may be what you think, but what I'm trying to get at is what is the dominant narrative? So what are the commonly known characteristics or emblems of Māori identity? When people think and talk about Māori, what do they think and say? So we've got honourable, once were warriors, explorers, good singers, haka, good at sport, proud, rich culture, Māori elite, warriors, creative, unique to New Zealand, a collective, gangs, whakapapa, bad parents, poor, whānau, tiki, unique, that was another one, athletes, lazy, marae, dull, strong leaders, prison population, giving, artistic, the misconception about the peaceful colonisation of New Zealand, Tātai, get over it, and rugby. Oh, hold it, was that get over it rugby? No, there was a full stop, I read it out properly. Communal mindset, moko, good looking if you're from Taranaki. Oh, okay, kia ora mātene. Patriotic, kapai, navigators, just looking, poor health comes, welfare dependent, pukana, carving, overrepresented in the bad statistics, manakitanga, whakapapa, tikanga. Okay, kapai, tāmoko. Right, well, again, something I prepared earlier. Now you can see, and thank you for sharing, I appreciate that. I realize that some people might look at this and say, that's not an accurate portrayal of Māori. And others will say, well, that is exactly what is actually spoken about. The reason I'm able to pull this up is because it is, like the previous one around the New Zealand narrative, it is absolutely are the kind of things that come through when I ask people to do the same exercise. Again, one end of the country to the other. There are a number of positive things in here that, you know, that you might interpret as being positive. Like if you're a good artist, you're good at music, you can play the guitar, you've got a good sense of humor, and you have got rhythm. Those things are pretty cool. But right alongside them are a lot of those negative statistics that came through, or the negative representations like gangs, domestic violence, once were warriors. And these things go side by side. The interesting thing is, and one of the things that I ask people is, well, how do you think it feels being Māori in New Zealand, or being a Māori child, a parent, a Māori employee, if you know that this is the view that people come to when they talk about Māori? Even if it has nothing to do with your own experience or the life you might live, that doesn't matter what you do personally, that this is a perception people have about Māori. How do you think it feels to be Māori and know this preconceived view of being Māori is so prevalent in the country, so prevalent that it doesn't matter where you go, you're likely to come across it? I guess it's a leading question because I kind of know the answer. And the reality is that people, you can get angry, you can get upset, people it plays out in people's emotions in all sorts of ways, but it's not good to know that you've got this conflict all the time when you ask people this, or when you go anywhere. It means that when you go and apply to rent a house, when you apply for a job, when you go and meet somebody for the first time, when you walk into a schoolroom, when you walk into the school gate, or go into the staff room, that it's likely that you will be thinking that people's view about Māori are somewhat shaped by this really dominant narrative that we have. I want to challenge also the idea of the good bits and suggest that even the good bits are the bits that Māori have been allowed to be good at. I'm going to talk a bit more about that. The thing is, the bad statistics, if this is all you see, and you don't know how it's occurred, how Māori have ended up being in a situation where we are overrepresented in a lot of the negative statistics, all you're left with is this view without an understanding of the cause that has created the effect. And what that does is it means that it influences, it can't help but influence behaviors and practices, expectations and relationships, and also deliberate actions. So I want you to think for a moment about how these stereotypes influence you and your organization in these areas. Understanding that they are the dominant narrative that's out there, to even ask yourself, what do you do in your own environment to deliberately challenge that narrative? Not just that you might not agree with it or think it, but if we know that that's what's spoken, what do we do to actively challenge it? I guess, again, a leading question, because I'm thinking that we don't do enough. We don't do enough to not only challenge what we might hear or what we believe people might think, but even to go back to understand that relationship between cause and effect. So let us talk about addressing bias and stereotyping. And I'm going to give us a view of education. Starting with the first question, what do we know about the basis upon which the New Zealand education system was formed? What were the intentions behind our system, its policies and the resulting practices. The real question is, was equity a consideration? So someone has shared in the chat that, well, the goal was assimilation. Definitely there were assimilative policies in place. But I just want you to think about that. Was our education system set up to achieve equity? If we go back to look at where the thinking came from and the genesis of the thinking around our education system, I would suggest that equity wasn't a consideration. The New Zealand education system was set up in a way that deliberately sought to create inequities of access and opportunities for certain groups, including Māori, not limited to Māori, but including Māori. It's important to understand the relationship between the inequities in education and what is currently being experienced today. And the historic and current policies and practices and thinking that lay at their root, that was the basis of that thinking. To look at it at a systems level, I want to highlight the practice of streaming. Now, streaming wasn't what we're doing now in terms of the internet. This is the practice of streaming that was a tool in our education system that was designed to create inequity. It was strongly rooted in bias and prejudice. Bias and prejudice about people's abilities based on things such as race, gender, class, and their physical abilities, for example. The practice of streaming saw people channeled or siphoned or sifted into certain subjects, classes, or occupations based on those perceived abilities. It influenced also the classification of knowledge, of having a hierarchy of knowledge, where we said some kind of knowledge is more important than others. Now, if we look at the channeling of Māori students in our education system, I'm going to share now some examples where I can show you how intentional it was. Don't worry too much that I'm starting in 1862. I know we've got a limited time and I'm not doing a year by year, a week by week account of our history. I do want to, though, highlight some examples of how that discrimination was intentionally designed into our system, where the thinking came from. So in 1862, the school inspector reports to the House of Representatives that, and I quote, "a refined education or high mental culture would be inappropriate for Māori because they are better calculated by nature to get their living by manual than by mental labour." It's pretty full on. I can see in the chat someone's talking about, thanks a lot, Darwin. Absolutely, we know where this comes from. But it's pretty explicit, isn't it? Better calculated by nature to get their living by manual than by mental labour. Now, you might think 1862 is a long time ago. It was. There wasn't much positive thinking about women at the time, let alone those with different abilities. In terms of physical abilities as well. So there was a lot of boxing going on. In 1867, the Native Schools Act was passed, and this Schools Act meant that it was, the Act preferred English as the only language for the education of Māori children. They didn't ramp up the attack on this until just after 1900. But the Act explicitly said that schools are to focus more on manual subjects and manual instruction than academic subjects for Māori. Now, there were Māori schools under the Native Schools Act and other schools. So whilst other schools were to focus on academic, schools for Māori were to focus on manual subjects. Again, pretty explicit. In 1880, Te Reo College produced its first wave of Māori graduates. These are some of them in the pictures here. And Te Reo College, for those of you that don't know, is a Māori boarding school, a native school in the Hawke's Bay for boys. And they had a principal by the name of John Thornton. And John Thornton was a Pākehā principal who decided that he wanted to give his students the same opportunities as others. So he started teaching academic subjects. He gave the boys the opportunity to study the subjects that you needed to get into university at the time, to get UE. Anyone guess what were the subjects, the 3 subjects you needed to get into university back in the day? And it wasn't English, maths, or science. Thank you, Jeremy. Latin, Greek, and one other. Oh, I'm looking at the chat. No, it wasn't French. It was Latin, French, and we had the Greek. It was very close to the classics. So John Thornton taught them Latin, Greek, and the classics. They all graduated, and we had this wave of Māori academics coming through who became our first doctor, that's Sir Maui Pomare, first BALLB, our first Māori lawyer, Sir Apirana Ngata, Sir Peter Buck. We had scientists, ethnologists, doctors, lawyers. We had this wave coming through. So what do you think happened? Well, John Thornton, Principal Thornton, got put under pressure to abandon the academic subjects and teach agriculture instead. You might think that this was a slap in the face when they've shown that Māori can succeed when given the opportunity. Well, the reality was that wasn't the intention of our education system. It wasn't the intention to have Māori on an academic pathway because it went against the intended place in society for Māori people, which is why they wanted them to concentrate on manual labour and manual subjects. So this is an example of streaming where it wasn't just about assessing somebody's ability, it was saying we want this group to be performing these roles, so therefore we won't give them access to the education pathway. John Thornton protested, and he actually fought because he said that this was inequitable. In the end, a law was passed that forbid the teaching of academic subjects in the native schools, an amendment to the Education Act. So he fought vigorously and in the end was removed from that position. And so you started to see the dwindling of Māori coming through and succeeding. So just jumping through, you can, again, that's quite explicit about how it happened. In 1903, the attack on the language and it's been spoken by Māori children in the schools increased. So corporal punishment, physical abuse of children, if they got caught speaking Māori, was not only supported, but the policy was ramped up. And a wide range of punishments were used against children who spoke Te Reo in the classroom, but actually even outside of the classroom. And this had a huge impact on Māori families not wanting their children to be to experience that abuse, and so it stopped the intergenerational transmission of language in the home. Parents speaking to children, they stopped, and it had a huge impact on the death of Māori language within certain families and communities. It was not unique. The same policy had been used in Ireland, in Scotland, in Canada, and America, and Australia. Actually, it's not even a colour thing. Anywhere in the world that colonizes another people, the first thing they do is try and attack the language and stop people speaking that language, because that breaks up communities and it breaks up social cohesion. And it's easier to get the people you are colonizing to do what you need them to do if they do not have the strength of culture and collectivity and language around them. It was a blueprint for colonization used for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So I want to jump now through to 1915. Don't worry, I'll speed up in a minute. And here's another example where the Department of Education, in their annual report, the inspector says, so far as the department is concerned, there is no encouragement given to Māori boys who wish to enter the learned professions. The aim is to turn, if possible, their attention to the branches of industry for which Māori seems best suited. It's pretty out there, right? You can see why now I'm saying it was intentionally set up for to prevent the access of Māori to academic subjects. Now, it carries on, and in 1930 and 1931, I have to hand it to the teachers who stand up to fight for what's right. The New Zealand Federation of Teachers actually petitioned, and it was a big petition, to have Te Reo introduced into the national curriculum. They wanted it. They imagine how we would be now if we'd had access to that from 1930 and 31. But the Director of Education blocked it. He would not allow it. He did not accept it. And he said, in his view, the natural abandonment of the native tongue involves no loss to the Māori. And he went on to say in his report that education should lead the Māori lad to be a good farmer and the Māori girl to be a good farmer's wife. Again, pretty explicit. And I've said to many people a lot that I would have been a useless farmer's wife, not only just for the poor farmer, but actually for the animals. That was never going to be a good outcome. But again, it's just so limiting in terms of what the expectations were for Māori, and not only the expectations, what barriers were then put in place so that they would only ever succeed to that. Now, think about that when we looked at what Māori people are known to be good at, and why I said music, dance, being good at sport, being good at art. These are the things that Māori were allowed to be good at. And that became so ingrained in our view of ourselves. Well, by the 1980s and 90s, government policy reflected the attitude that it was socioeconomic factors that were the root cause of Māori underachievement. Now, that's a change in the way people were wording it. It wasn't so explicit as to say this is what we want for Māori, but the policies from generations before actually meant that it had been achieved. The outcomes that had been intended with that structuring of people and structuring of our education system had been achieved. By the 80s and 90s, Māori were predominantly in negative socioeconomic position. The challenge here was that by the 80s and 90s, instead of actually saying we intend to keep Māori in these positions in society, now they're saying it's Māori's fault for being in these positions for society, and started blaming the families to say they just don't value education. If only they aspired to greater things for their children. They don't care about education, so that's why they're not progressing like everyone else, because we all get an equal chance. And you can see how that narrative started to become a dominant narrative because it had, like I say, the system had achieved in what it set out to do. Okay, so I give these examples to explain the history of streaming. In my view, this is how we ended up with streaming and coming up with a hierarchy of knowledge, of people, and potential. And now you'll see streaming happening when people get a test to go into a course, or maybe get placed into secondary school, and we test their ability in a few subjects to see which class that they're going to be in. And we know that, I mean, it's still predominant today. It's not just at secondary school. streaming happens with ability classes in primary school and even early childhood sometimes. And it doesn't matter if you call the group the keriru or the tui or the octopuses, the kids know what are the expected abilities of the different groups and which one's at the top and which one's at the bottom. But I saw somebody in the chat earlier talking about the language and the streaming with the languages at school as well. Absolutely right. So the streaming in the old school C system, I know, I'm showing my age, was that the Māori language was the only language in the New Zealand curriculum to be considered non-academic. Every other language, and at that stage you could do Japanese, they just introduced Spanish, you could do German, French, all of those ones, if you studied those subjects, were considered A stream. Māori was the only language to be put down at the same level as home economics and woodwork. And I think I'm not suggesting that they're not good subjects. What I'm saying is that we have this hierarchy, and Māori language was the only one not to be considered an academic subject. So moving forward to the system we are now, we find that for Māori, this practice of streaming is especially damning. It reinforces the stereotyping, the deficit thinking, and racism, and it all leads to our foundation classes or the bottom classes in a streamed system being dominated by Māori and Pākehā, by Māori and Pasifika, and the top classes being non-Māori, non-Pasifika, other groups. And what it does is it internalizes these stereotypes. We have a plan to end the practice of streaming by 2030. There's a link, there's a copy of the report, Kōkiri here, that's come out, and our organisation, Tātai Ahoro, and many others have joined together to look at how we can remove streaming from our schools. But to just make this point that it's a practice that we're all used to, and we've spent generations justifying. We're really good at justifying it by saying, oh, when we stream, it means that the teachers can really work with those that need it, and those that need the extension get it too. We've got the lines and the rhetoric to help justify it. But what we know is that it's incredibly debilitating for those that aren't necessarily perceived to have good learning potential, or that their abilities are less, and it hurts. It creates harm and negative self views about your ability to learn, and so it becomes generational as well. But it's also saying that it's requires a new way of teaching. You know, we can't just take away the practice and then teach the same. We actually have to teach differently if we want true equitable outcomes. Okay, so let's talk about another example. And I'm going to have to go really quickly because I've been speaking far too slow. My apologies. Around other examples of streaming, which are, for example, the leadership and representation within our public service, where we see Māori and Pacific people and members of other ethnic communities less likely to hold leadership roles. We also have this thing called occupational segregation, where women, men were often suggested that they should do certain occupations as opposed to others. And we see this bias and discrimination come through. The bias and discrimination about what you're good at comes from these deeply held societal beliefs about gender, ethnicity, work, and family. And I love this image of that I managed to find online around the equity pay gap. The fact is, this was over 50 years ago that the Act got passed, and we still don't have equity of pay for females. We don't have equity of pay by ethnic grouping. And so I challenge us to say, hey, we've done a lot. We've done a lot to move forward, but actually is better good enough in terms of equity? Okay. So I want us to really quickly just think about leading for equity and then what it requires us to do. Understanding that our structures and our systems have been built on this belief system that has shaped educational success, but also who works in what jobs, etc. It means that we need to make transformational shift in our thinking, not just becoming more informed and aware, or reforming, tinkering around the edges. Well, if we really want to have an equitable Aotearoa, we need to think into the future about transforming the system. And in your own time, I also want you to think about your own company or organization's story of equity. To really dig down and say, actually, have you asked the people within your organization, within your kura, your school, your business, around their equity experience? Do we know what it's like to be that person within the business, within the neighborhood, at the local dairy, in the pool? Do we really have the same history? By doing this, what I suggest we can do is we start by opening our eyes to be informed, understand why these perceptions exist, but also acknowledge the purpose behind them, how these things actually came to be. Once we open our eyes, we're in a better position to open our hearts, to understand the impact of these narratives on the lives of our whānau, of our tamariki, of people within our community. And when you can understand the impact, we also then can understand the need for change. And finally, opening our minds to be open to creating a new narrative, brave enough to challenge current practice. It requires bravery because it is a hard thing to do when a lot of the thinking is so prevalent, but also so ingrained in our national understanding of ourselves. Leading for equity, we have to name it. We have to identify with an equity lens what we see and where inequities exist. Then we have to own it. Yes, it can be a negative thing looking at our history to see how deliberate some of the inequitable practices are, but actually own it. It's not about feeling guilty. You should only feel guilty when we know it, we see it, and then we don't do anything about it. So the last thing to lead for equity is to act on it, to step up and respond in a positive way to make those shifts. So finally, and I know I've left a few minutes, sorry for the wonderful interpreters at how quick I've been speaking, but left a few minutes for questions. But the challenge for us, I use this term, kai akwe te tikaka, Kāi Tahu dialect, apologies everyone, which means actually the power is with you. You have the ability to make the change. And if there's something I'd love you to leave the session with today, would be these 3 requests. That if we want to change Aotearoa to be an equitable and thriving Aotearoa, we can start by doing our bit to be aware, to be brave, and be deliberate. Kia ora tātai.
Kia ora, Hana. Thank you so much for that incredible, inspiring, confronting kōrero. Hana, I would like to ask you right off the bat, you shared examples. We started way back when, 1800s, that's a lifetime ago. Surely it's not like that anymore. You brought us up to the 80s and the 90s. Surely today, everything's fine. Is that a question that you get a lot?
I think people, I don't get the question a lot, but people do go back to that default position of saying, well, it's people's own fault because we've got free education, we've got free healthcare, and people come back to that default position. So I think it's obvious, and you can hear it as we go into an election year this year, people talking about what's not right about and what inequities do exist. But it's the fact that we don't acknowledge where they come from, where they came from, and our role in perpetuating some of the environments that can allow them to continue. So people, I don't think, are completely over. It's like some people, we still say that we're clean and green. Well, we know that you can't swim in most of the rivers in New Zealand right now because that they're not safe. But we know that, but we still don't really own the narrative as to, why that's happened and what our role is in it to make it change.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to get to a couple of these questions that are coming through here in the Q&A. Just before I do, Whānau, we have a session coming up with Hana, a full one-day session on equity for leaders. That is here in Ōtautahi Christchurch. That is an extraordinary experience. If you can participate in that one-day session, if this is a topic that is important to you, I highly recommend getting along. I've just put the link in the chat, and we will send you some information on it. So that is the 22nd of August here in Ōtautahi Christchurch. All right, we have a question here from Gabrielle Nicholson, who says, in some cases, the racism is so entrenched, the easiest route is to wait for a cohort to die. How do you tackle racism when it's so ingrained, it's like the air that the person breathes?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question, because it can be really overwhelming when you're dealing with people really entrenched in their view. And I get that. I get the idea of waiting for some people to die in terms of the old generation, but I would caution us that a lot, and we're seeing it now, we're seeing it come through just even in the last few years with some of the things that's happened, that it's not just an old generation, it is intergenerational. So if we don't try and tackle it, then we're just going to get younger people now who have some of those same views that will become the older ones in their time. So waiting to die, I understand it's not really the best response. And maybe I have to come back to that strategy of creating awareness. What Dad said, that if you only knew what they only know, you'd probably think the same. So actually, we need to change what they know. We need to show the evidence, an undisputable evidence. Let's put it there, but engage people in a conversation that really helps them understand what they haven't had access to. Once they've had access to it and they still want to have their entrenched negative, bias, racist views, then, okay, we can put them into the idiot and other language category. But I would honestly believe, and I have to believe this, that most New Zealanders have 100% good intent. And we believe in the notion of equity. We just need to understand that we haven't seen the true story or heard the true story. And I believe if we can show people by opening their minds, we can get to their hearts. And New Zealanders are absolutely, we've done it. First to give women the vote, gay rights, we've done it with, nuclear free. We stand up against things that are inherently wrong when we can see that they're wrong. And so I would say, keep up the fight. And the fact that we've had so many positive people join in this conversation today gives me some hope for the fact that the tide can change.
Beautiful. We have time for one more question. I did get a comment that my mic audio is a little distorted, so I have made an adjustment. Hopefully that is better for you. We've got two questions that have come through that are similar. One from Richard Kite, who says, Kia ora Hana, where in the world have we seen these inequities challenged well? And then we also have a question from Mina Kadri, who says, do you have specific examples of transforming for equity from a particular organization? So do we have examples of where we've seen this being done well?
Yes, there are, probably not in the 3 minutes that we've got left, but I can, let me think. There are examples where people have actively looked to create opportunities of access to education. And I know like Finland's a good example in terms of what they've done to ensure that everyone has equitable access to education. But there's also examples even in Canada and in America and other places where they have affirmative action or positive discrimination strategies that are targeted to address inequity. I have to say that, you can almost look anywhere in the world and find good examples, but then also inequities prevail. But in New Zealand, I believe that some of the work that we are doing, I've seen schools who have absolutely transformed, taken streaming out and actually challenged themselves on their equity data in a way that they have to make a change to teaching practice, and the outcomes for those students have been incredible. And there's also some in the workplace where we've actually been, we've led the way to change some of the bias associated with male, female, the bias around those with disability or different abilities being able to access employment opportunities. And people are calling out practice and actually standing up and responding to them. But I think I need to probably find a bit more than the 1 minute to come through with a list of the examples.
You know, we always get questions. We had a question here about how we can accelerate this equity mahi so it can inspire and become a compass. This is the mahi, isn't it? These conversations, this discussion, this awareness raising, eye-opening, let's look at what actually drove the root causes of this. Would you agree with that? Any thoughts on, you know, what we can be doing?
Absolutely, I think, and that's why I say be aware, be informed, make sure, you know, if we haven't had access to the story, we actually need to do a bit of the legwork to go and learn what learn the other side. We have Aotearoa New Zealand histories that's going to be taught in our schools soon, and that's going to be a huge move, but we've got a big gap and the teachers often that are having to teach this, they haven't had access to that history either a lot of the time. So, you know, do what it takes to be aware and be informed. Challenge the stereotypes. Think, where did they come from? What do I now need to know? And have conversations with people where you can start to unpack and challenge things. Don't allow the racist negative bias to be part of our ordinary conversation. Let's just be the kind of Aotearoa we want to be. That means we need to be apply that equity lens, but also let our hearts engage and support everyone around us in a way that truly allows for equitable outcomes for our people.
Beautiful. We are out of time, team. I'm going to put this link to the session that we have coming up with Hana in the chat once more. It's a one-day session, Equity for Leaders. I want to give a huge mihi to Te Reo, who did our fantastic sign language interpretation. Thank you so much, Jen and Nick, for that phenomenal job. I want to give a huge mihi to you, Marikura, Hana, for your incredible generosity in sharing this kōrero with us, taking the time to share this. If you are interested in the one-dayer, come to the one-dayer. For additional work that Hana does, please have a look at Tātai Core Education. They do phenomenal mahi in the equity space. And finally, I want to give a huge mihi thank you to everyone who has tuned in for today, for spending your sacred, non-renewable time with us. We take that as a huge gift and an honor. We take it seriously. And we trust you got massive value from today's session. Thank you so much, team. We will look forward to seeing you at a future impact session or at Hana's Equity for Leaders session. Ka kite anō.
Ka kite, nō hora mai koutou. Hei konara.